going to tell you something the pharmacies spent a lot of money making sure you forgot. And if you live somewhere cold and remote, this might be the most important thing you hear all winter. Down in the cities, a winter cold is an inconvenience. You call in sick, you drive to the drugstore, you spend $40 on a bag of little colored pills, and in a week, you're back at your desk. Up here, it doesn't work that way. Up here, a sickness that settles into your chest at 40 below, when the nearest road is buried and the nearest town is a long way off and nobody's coming, that sickness can put you in the ground. I have watched it happen. So when I tell you the old sourdoughs had a $2 remedy that kept them well through some of the cruelest winters this continent has to offer, I am not spinning you a yarn. I am telling you what I know, and what the pharmacy would just as soon you never figured out. I am Cyrus Hale. Most people who know me call me Klondike. I spent the better part of 40 years prospecting and living rough in the Alaskan interior, most of it within reach of Fairbanks, a lot of it in places no road has ever touched. I have slept in canvas wall tents when it was cold enough to freeze the breath on your mustache before it hit the ground. I have worked claims through November and December when the sun barely dragged itself above the horizon for a few gray hours before giving up and going back down. I have packed enough dry spruce and banked enough coals, we covered all of that in the last few videos, to keep a man alive through the dark months. But heat and fuel are only part of the story. A man can be warm and still go down sick. And a sick man at 40 below is a man in serious trouble. The old-timers knew this. The sourdoughs who came up during the Klondike rush and the men who stayed on afterward, they learned it the hard way, same as most things up here get learned. They watched partners go down with fevers nobody could explain, and gums that went soft, and men who just got weaker and weaker through January until there was nothing left to do. And the ones who survived, the ones who made it through winter after winter in a dirt floor cabin with no pharmacy, no doctor within 100 miles, and nothing to eat but what they'd put up in the fall. Those men figured something out. They figured out that the land itself was offering them medicine, that the spruce tree standing 10 feet from the cabin door was a pharmacy, that the general store, when they got to it twice a year, stocked the one or two things nature couldn't quite hand them directly, and that, all of it together, the knowledge and the habits and the $2 remedies, added up to something a whole shelf of modern pills costs 100 times more to replicate. I want to walk you through what they knew, all of it, start to finish, because I have used every one of these myself, and because I have buried partners who didn't take it seriously enough. And I would rather you hear it from a man who was out there than read a label on a bottle someone charged you $30 for. Let's start with the one remedy that every single frontier household kept, from the Alaskan interior all the way down through the rural Midwest, from homesteaders to fishing families to old prospectors sitting on a creek bank at 60 below, the amber bottle, cod liver oil. I know some of you just made a face. I know. I made that same face when I was a boy, and my grandmother came at me with a spoon of the stuff. It smells like the bottom of a fishing boat. It tastes worse, but I will tell you this. I never once argued with it after my first winter out in the bush, because I saw what happened to the men who skipped it. Here is what nobody told us in school. Up here in Alaska, and really anywhere north of, say, the 45th parallel, the sun in winter gets so low in the sky that your skin cannot manufacture vitamin D from it. It is just too weak, too low, too brief. From sometime in October through sometime in March, you are not making your own vitamin D no matter how much time you spend outside. And vitamin D is not optional. It is what your immune system runs on. When it drops, your defenses drop with it, and that is when every germ that comes through the door finds a body that can barely fight back. The old sourdoughs didn't know the word vitamin D. That language came later, but they knew that a man who went through a sunless Alaskan winter without his cod liver oil came out of it thin and sick and wrong in ways that were hard to name, and they knew that a man who kept his daily spoonful mostly stayed on his feet. What they were doing, without knowing it, was replacing the vitamin D their skin could no longer make. Cod liver oil carries it naturally, along with vitamin A, along with the long-chain omega fats that the body needs and that frontier men got from eating fish and game the way their grandfathers did. 1 spoonful a day. That was the whole prescription. It cost pennies from any general store, and it did more for a man's winter health than most of what sits behind the pharmacy counter today. Now, the drug companies looked at that amber bottle and they saw a problem. Because 1 cheap bottle of cod liver oil was doing several jobs at once, and you couldn't charge separately for each job if you sold it that way. So over time, they split it apart. Here is your vitamin D supplement, $12. Here is your vitamin A supplement, $14. Here is your fish oil capsule, another $20. And the old amber bottle got pushed to the back of the shelf where they hoped you wouldn't notice it was still there, still doing every one of those jobs for $2 and change. I still buy it. I still take it every October, and I stop when the real sun comes back in spring. 40 winters, and I can count on one hand the times I have been laid up sick. You think that's coincidence? You go ahead and think that. Now, the next remedy is one that men on the trail learned to their grief before they learned to use it. Scurvy. People think of scurvy as a sailor's disease, something that happened on long voyages in the 1700s. And yes, that's where history noticed it first. But scurvy killed gold rush miners too, killed men on the Klondike Trail, men who'd packed in plenty of flour and salt pork and beans, but had nothing green, nothing fresh, nothing that carried what the body needs to hold itself together. Vitamin C. Without it, the body can't maintain its own connective tissue. The gums go soft and bleed. The joints ache. Old wounds that healed years ago can actually reopen. And in the end, you just come apart. It is a terrible way to go, and it is entirely 100% preventable. The native peoples of the North knew the answer and had known it long before any prospector showed up with a gold pan and a bad plan. The answer was standing right outside the door. The spruce tree, the pine, the fir, their needles are green all winter long, and those needles are loaded with vitamin C. A USDA Forest Service study found that eastern white pine needles contain somewhere between 72 and 187 milligrams of ascorbic acid per 100 grams of needles, with the older 1-year-old needles running higher than the fresh new growth. Those are real numbers. That is not a folk tale. That is a genuine, measurable, documented vitamin C source that grows for free in the boreal forest and does not require a bottle or a label or a trip to town. The old sourdoughs made tea from it, and they were right to. You pull a small handful of green spruce or pine needles, you rinse them, you pour hot water over them, not boiling because high heat can start to degrade some of the vitamin C, and you let them steep for several minutes. The tea comes out pale gold with a piney, resinous smell that is actually pleasant once you get used to it. Slightly sour. A cup a day was enough to keep scurvy at bay through a whole interior winter. Free, off any spruce in the yard, every single day from October to April. Now, I have to stop here and say something plain, because I'd rather say it than have you skip it. When you forage anything from the land, you have to know what you're picking. That rule is not optional. There is a tree called yew. It grows across a good portion of North America. It stays green all winter, and at a casual glance, it can look like a harmless evergreen. It is not. harmless. Every part of the yew tree is toxic. The needles, the bark, the berries, all of it. A tea brewed from yew needles can kill you. This is not a story. Before you brew needle tea from anything, you positively identify the tree as spruce, pine, or fir. Spruce needles come off individually all the way around the twig, stiff, and if you roll one between your fingers, it rolls. Fir needles are flat and don't roll. Pine needles come in bundles of 2, 3, or 5. None of them are yew, but you learn the difference before you start. You do not guess. The frontier taught that lesson in blood, and I am passing it on to you for free. All right, now we get into the smaller remedies, the cupboard medicines that every frontier household kept, and that any man heading into the bush for the winter would have thought about as carefully as he thought about his ammunition and his flour. Garlic. Raw garlic. When a sourdough felt the first tickle in the back of his throat, the first sign that something was trying to get started, he ate garlic. Not cooked, not powdered, not in a capsule. Raw, chopped or chewed, and mixed with a little onion if he had it. The old-timers swore by it, and I swore by it too for years before I understood why it might actually work. The sulfur compounds in fresh garlic have been studied extensively for their antimicrobial properties, and the traditional use tracks with what the science suggests. Raw garlic in the earliest stage of a sniffle, eaten aggressively for a couple of days. It won't win you any friends in a small cabin. The smell is considerable. But in a one-man camp, nobody's complaining. Honey. Real honey. Not the processed corn syrup imitation in the plastic bear. Raw honey has antibacterial properties that have been known and used since before recorded medicine. Wound dressings, throat coatings, cough suppressants. Honey has served all of those purposes for a very long time, and frontier households kept it for exactly those reasons. A spoonful of honey in hot water with a squeeze of lemon if you had it, or just straight from the jar for a raw throat. For a cut or a minor skin wound in the field, a smear of honey under a clean bandage can help keep infection from taking hold when you're days away from anything better. These are not fairy tales. These are real properties in real honey. And the old-timers who kept a jar on the shelf weren't doing it just because it was sweet. And then there was the hot toddy. I want to be plain about this one too. A hot toddy, a small measure of whiskey in hot water with honey and maybe a little lemon, was used by frontier men as a chill breaker. The idea was to drive a chill out before it had a chance to settle into the chest and turn into something serious. The warmth, the honey, the steam, those do real work. The whiskey in a small amount may take the edge off enough to let a cold man sleep. The old sourdoughs didn't drink themselves into a stupor with it. They used it like a medicine, a small dose at the right moment, and then they slept. That discipline is the whole difference between a useful old remedy and a bad habit, and those old men knew it. Now, willow bark, birch inner bark. I want to take a moment with these because they are among the most fascinating pieces of forgotten frontier medicine I know. The inner bark of the willow tree contains a compound called salicin. When your body processes salicin, it converts it into salicylic acid, which is the direct chemical precursor to aspirin. The pharmaceutical industry did not invent this. They isolated and synthesized a version of what the willow tree already made, put it in a white tablet, and sold it back to you. The old-timers who steeped willow bark in hot water and drank the bitter tea for fever and aches and muscle pain were not practicing superstition. They were using the original formulation of one of the most widely used medicines in human history. Birch inner bark contains similar compounds, and where willow wasn't close at hand, birch served the same purpose. The way the sourdoughs made it was simple. They'd strip a piece of inner bark from a willow or birch, the inner bark, the pale layer just beneath the outer rough bark, and steep it in hot water for a good while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, until the water turned amber and bitter. That bitter taste is the salicin. They drink it for a fever, for the body aches that come at the start of a sickness, for a headache from the cold and the dark. Now I have to pass on the same caution that comes with any aspirin. This is a real compound that acts like aspirin in the body, which means the same people who need to be careful with aspirin need to be careful here. You do not give willow bark tea to a child with a fever. Same reason you don't give children aspirin, and that is a serious reason. If you have a sensitivity or allergy to aspirin, skip this one. And if you're on blood thinners or certain other medications, talk to someone who can advise you before you start dosing yourself with it. The old-timers had a respect for these remedies because they understood they were real medicine, not just folk comfort. Real medicine has real effects and real cautions. The chest remedies. When a cold or a chill had already started to move down into the lungs, the sourdoughs had two tools they reached for. The first was the chest rub. Animal fat, goose grease if they had it, bear fat, whatever they'd rendered down and kept in a jar, rubbed warm onto the chest and covered with a flannel cloth. This is essentially the great-grandmother of the modern mentholated chest rub. The fat traps warmth against the skin. The warmth loosens the chest. Some men added a few drops of conifer resin or pine oil to the grease for its own warming, aromatic effect. The modern product in the blue tin owes a debt to this old remedy it's never going to acknowledge. The second tool was steam. A pot of water brought to a boil with a handful of conifer needles thrown in, spruce, fir, pine, and then the sick man would lean over the pot with a cloth over his head and breathe the steam in slowly. The heat and moisture opened the passages. The volatile oils in the needles, the piney, resinous compounds that give the boreal forest its smell, may have added something on top of that. Men who were starting to wheeze and tighten in the chest often came out of a good steam session breathing easier. It cost nothing. It required only a fire, a pot, water, and a handful of the needles that were already going into the tea. And now I want to talk about the thing that mattered more than all the remedies put together. Because the real medicine, the thing the old sourdoughs understood at a level that most modern people have completely lost track of, was prevention, not treatment. Prevention. The first rule was stay dry. I cannot say this plainly enough. Wet feet at 40 below is not a medical problem. It is a survival problem. A man who walks through slush in poor boots, or who sweats into his wool socks and doesn't change them, or who lets his mittens stay wet when he's working, that man has put himself in a situation where frostbite is only the most obvious danger. Cold and wet together drain the body's heat so fast that the immune system goes down with the core temperature, and then whatever germ is nearby has a wide open door. The old-timers were fanatical about dry feet and dry clothes. Wool was the standard because wet wool still holds most of its warmth. But even wool has limits, and every experienced man in the interior changed his socks at the first hint of dampness and kept his outer layer of footwear waterproofed with grease before it got wet rather than after. The second rule was keep the core warm. The body will sacrifice the extremities to protect the core if it has to. That's just physiology. The same physiology that makes your fingers go numb first while your chest stays warm. But a sustained cold core is a sustained sick man. We covered heat management and how to keep a small space warm in the first couple of videos, so I won't retread that ground. But a body properly fed and housed can maintain its own furnace in a way that becomes the deepest form of disease prevention there is. Which brings me to eating. The old sourdoughs ate fat. They ate it deliberately, and they ate a lot of it. Not because they didn't know better, they knew exactly what they were doing. Fat is calorie-dense fuel, and in a cold environment, calories are warmth. The body burns enormous amounts of energy just staying warm at 40 below, and a man who tries to get by on lean rations in deep winter comes out thin and sick and cold no matter how good his fire is. Pemmican, salt pork, rendered lard, the fat cap on a moose roast, these were not indulgences on the frontier. They were medicine. They were the fuel that kept the body's furnace running hot enough to fight off whatever came at it. And sleep. The dark months in the Alaskan interior give a man a gift that he would be a fool to squander. The longest nights of the year. A 12, 14, 16-hour darkness that his body was designed to sleep through. The old-timers didn't fight it. They slept long, and they slept when the body said to sleep. Sleep is when the immune system does its repair work, and a man who was serious about staying healthy through the winter was also serious about getting into his bunk when the work was done and not burning his lamp oil to read until midnight. Rest was not laziness on the frontier. It was one of the most practical things a man could do for himself. So let me walk back through all of it because I want you to see what this actually costs. A bottle of cod liver oil at the general store or the drugstore, even today, is $2 or $3. Spruce needle tea costs you nothing but the time to walk outside and pick it. Raw garlic and onions, a few dollars for enough to last a month. A jar of real honey, a few dollars more, and it lasts all season. Willow bark is free off any creek bank. The goose grease or the rendered lard from whatever meat you're putting up comes free with the animal. The steam treatment is free. The habits, staying dry, sleeping enough, eating fat and meat, those aren't purchases at all. They are choices. The drug companies did not invent health. I want to be careful how I say this because I am not telling you to refuse medicine when you need it. I've walked into a clinic when I needed to, and I'm still here to tell about it. But what the industry built was a replacement for knowledge. They took what the sourdoughs already knew, and they bottled it, and they separated it, and they sold each piece back to you with a markup. And somewhere in that process, the knowledge itself got buried. The idea that your spruce tree is a vitamin C source, that willow bark is aspirin's ancestor, that cod liver oil is doing the work of 3 separate supplement bottles. That knowledge lived in the folk wisdom of every northern culture for centuries before it became proprietary. Now, I also want to be clear about something else because the old-timers were clear about it too. These are remedies for the ordinary sicknesses of winter. A chill that comes on, a scratchy throat in the morning, a fever that breaks in a night, a chest that tightens up in the cold. The sourdoughs were hard men, but they were not stupid men, and they knew the difference between a cold they could sweat out with a hot toddy and a cup of needle tea and a sickness that was something more serious, a fever that climbs and doesn't stop, a chest that sounds wrong, a wound that's going bad. Those are not things you treat with garlic and honey and hope. Those are things you do whatever it takes to get real help for, even in the middle of a winter. Knowing these remedies doesn't mean throwing your judgment out the door. The best frontiersman I ever knew had an almost surgical sense of when he could handle something himself and when he couldn't. That judgment may be the most valuable thing of all. The old prospectors and the sourdoughs who built their lives in the Alaskan interior stayed well on $2 remedies and hard-won habits, not a pharmacy shelf. And every bit of that knowledge is still as good today as it was 100 years ago. I'm Klondike Cyrus, and I've been sharing what 40 winters in the Alaskan bush taught me. the stuff that doesn't show up on any store shelf, the frontier wisdom that kept rough men alive and working in conditions that most people today can barely imagine. If this is the first time you've found this channel, I'd ask you to subscribe and look back through what we've covered: the heat, the fire, the fuel, and now the medicine. Every one of these pieces fits together into something that I think matters more today than ever, which is the knowledge to take care of yourself without depending on a system that may not always be there when you need it. And I have one more thing for you. Down in the description of this video, there is a link to my off-grid cabin guide. It is free, and it pulls together the core of what I've been sharing here: the heating and the fuel and the frontier health habits and more, into one place you can read, save, and use. No charge, no catch, just the knowledge. That's how the old sourdoughs did it. You learned it, you passed it on, and you didn't charge a man for what might save his life. Stay dry, stay warm, and take care of yourself. Nobody else is going to do it for you.